It's Wednesday, the 26th of October. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And by popular demand, today let's talk about the Korean Air Airbus A330 runway overrun that occurred on Sunday, 23 October. Quick disclaimer, I've never flown the Airbus A330 series of aircraft. I'm current and qualified now on the Boeing 777 as a first officer, and I have flown the Airbus A320 and 321 series of aircraft, but never the A330 series. Let's start with the Aviation Safety Network report. There's been some important updates to this report since this one was published. 176 souls on board, no fatalities, 0 fatalities. Korean Air Flight 631 and Airbus 330-322 suffered a runway excursion after landing on runway 22 at Cebu International Airport, Philippines. The aircraft struck the ILS localizer antenna array for runway 22. That's that bridge-like structure that you see over the top of the aircraft. After overrunning the end of the runway, the nose landing gear appears to have collapsed prior to the aircraft hitting the antenna array. The flight departed Seoul Incheon International Airport at 10:20 Universal Time on the flight to Cebu. At 14:12 Universal Time, the flight aborted the first approach to runway 22 at Cebu, likely due to inclement weather, as there was a thunderstorm in the area with cumulonimbus clouds at 1,800 feet. The crew positioned for a second approach, which was aborted at 14:26, shortly after crossing the runway threshold. There's an update on that as well. The aircraft then entered a holding pattern for about 30 minutes before the third approach was attempted. At 15:08 Universal Time, that's 11 o'clock in the evening local time, the aircraft touched down on runway 22 and overran the end of the runway. Runway 22 has a landing distance available of 3,310 meters or 10,827 feet. That's the entire runway length, not counting the overruns. There's a 1,001 foot stopway off the end of runway 22, which would be the approach end in this case, and there's only a 197 foot stopway off of the departure end of runway 22 or the approach end of runway 04. The landing distance beyond the glide slope for runway 22 is noted down here in this fine print as 9,823 feet or 2,994 meters. Down here we can also see that the runway has runway lighting, centerline lighting, approach lighting system, runway end identifier lighting system, and a PAPI or a visual approach guidance lighting at 2.9 degrees, which is a normal glide path. There is an ILS available for runway 22. We don't know yet if this ILS was up and working for this crew at the time of the accident. Before we get to the updates, let's go to the Flight Radar 24 data and look at the last approach and landing that resulted in the runway overrun. Here we see the aircraft on left base entry for what I assume is the ILS runway 22 at Cebu, 3,000 feet, 188 knots. So they're slowed down to the appropriate speed. You want about 180 knots to the glide slope intercept, or the marker as we call it often in the industry. Turning on final, 172. Again, these are ground speeds. Slowing to 144. Okay, 2,500 feet, 147 knots, just 500 feet per minute down. A good stabilized approach. They go to approach speed early and hold it right there around 130 knots. Did you see that? At 1,000 feet, they were completely stable. They were fully configured, on speed, on glide path. About 800 feet per minute at this speed will give you that 2.9 degree glide path, plus or minus any winds. Now let's zoom in here and see if we can roughly determine where the touchdown point is. Investigators will have all of this data in exquisite detail once they download it off the aircraft, and will be able to tell exactly where this aircraft touched down and how this landing played out. Here they are at 375 feet on speed, 768 feet per minute, 150 feet. Okay, right there, 0 feet per minute. Let's back that up. 375 feet, 300 feet, 225, 150 feet. Typically, with these large aircraft, you want to cross the runway threshold at 50 feet on speed to land in the touchdown zone. Okay, right there is your first indication of aircraft on the ground. So it looks like they did touch down a little bit long, but still well within the touchdown zone. Let's take a closer look at that on the Google Maps. Cebu Airport's located here in the Philippines. Your two possible divert airports are Manila and Angels City, just to the north. So according to the rough preliminary ADSB data from Flight Radar 24, it appears as though the aircraft touched down somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feet down the runway. 1,500 feet down the runway is the optimum landing zone. This leaves over 8,600 feet of runway remaining, which in my opinion should be plenty of distance to get this aircraft stopped under normal conditions, even with a wet runway and with a wet runway with heavy rubber deposits on it. But as we look at these last couple of data points, you'll see a remarkable lack of deceleration of this aircraft. So here we are touching down at approximately 130 knots. Next data point shows 98 knots. A little further than midway down the runway. Next data point, 92 knots, approaching the last third, or well within the last third of the runway. 90 knots. And the final data point here on Flight Radar 24 indicating 90 knots with the aircraft located right here. So that's 90 knots with the last 1,000 feet of runway remaining. So the aircraft failed to decelerate properly on the rollout. And that's the question that investigators will need to answer, is how come the aircraft did not decelerate appropriately on this landing? The aircraft ended up going through the localizer antenna and parking itself right here about 1,000 feet off the end of the runway and very close to the wall and the population area just 300 feet further along. As we begin to look at the wreckage of the aircraft and its configuration in this parked position, we got to remember that sometimes the configuration changes after the accident. Now from here with the wreckage of the engines, I can't for sure tell, but I believe the engine thrust reversers were in the deployed position. I can see the leading edge slats are in the landing position. We'll talk more about the slides here in a minute. This bridge-like structure is that localizer antenna located off the end of the runway. Here's what a localizer antenna looks like off the end of the runway, this rather bridge-like structure which gives you left and right guidance for your precision approach into the runway. This big scar over the top of the cockpit is from the localizer antenna impacting that section of the fuselage. The nose gear is collapsed. And here we see the flaps in the landing position. But we see the ground spoilers in the retracted position. Now these ground spoilers, we don't know if they were deployed or not. It's often the case that these ground spoilers, once the hydraulics are turned off, the ground spoilers can retract slowly on their own, or the crew may have, out of habit, stowed the ground spoilers, or the crew may have been directed to stow the ground spoilers as part of their emergency evacuation checklist. So it's hard to tell about the status of the ground spoilers during the landing based on these photos. The ground spoilers are these giant barn door devices on the top of the wing that you see pop open every time you touch down as a passenger on your aircraft. These are divided between ground spoilers and flight spoilers. Some of these spoilers do operate in flight, but to a much less degree than you see here as ground spoilers. The importance of ground spoilers is they add additional drag to the aircraft, but what they do is they spoil the lift on the wings, which allow you to get the weight on the wheels to allow the brakes to work much more effectively. If the ground spoilers do not deploy, your brakes are not going to work nearly as good, and you're going to greatly increase your landing distance. These ground spoilers normally operate automatically as they are armed by pulling up on the speed brake lever on the A330, and they should deploy automatically once the aircraft senses weight on the wheels. If in the event that the ground spoilers are not armed, I believe on the A330 they will still deploy automatically once you bring the engines into reverse thrust. If in any event you do not get either of the spoilers to deploy automatically, you can always reach up here and deploy them manually. And that's something you need to be aware of on any of these landings. It's the job of the pilot not flying to monitor the status of the ground spoiler system and call it out if in the event the spoilers do not deploy. Here's a good picture of the spoilers operating in flight, or in-flight spoilers. They work together with the ailerons to help roll the aircraft. You can also deploy them in flight to help increase your rate of descent. The main wheels on the A330 are a twin bogie affair, 4 wheels where the rear wheels touch down first, followed by the front wheels, giving you those nice smooth landings. The brakes on all these modern airliners have at least 4 different ways of getting brake pressure to the brakes. Normal, alternate, reserve, and accumulator are normally the different brake application setups. And there is normally at least 3 different automatic brake settings that you can preset on the landing to give you a predetermined rate of deceleration on the braking system. And you can always override the automatic braking features with maximum manual braking by pressing down as hard as you can on the toe brakes located on the rudder pedals. And of course, anti-skid braking is available in nearly every mode of getting the brakes applied. So the basic procedure on landing: you land on speed in your touchdown zone. The rear wheels touch down first. The weight on wheels switch senses that the aircraft is on the ground. The ground spoilers automatically deploy, and the pilot selects reverse thrust, and either the auto brakes begin to slow the aircraft down, and or the pilot adds manual braking to slow the aircraft down. Once the aircraft comes to about 80 to 60 knots, you normally stow the reversers and then stow the ground spoilers well after you clear the runway, as per the after-landing checklist. Now let's go to Simon Radecki's Aviation Herald, where an update was added yesterday. On October 25, 2022, it became known that the captain of the flight provided testimony that they suffered a hard touchdown on their second approach due to wind shear forcing them down. During the following go-around, a warning light regarding the brakes came on. The crew therefore declared an emergency, prepared for the emergency landing, and performed a third approach in gusting winds and turbulence. A warning light regarding brake pressure came on at the time of touchdown, and they could not slow down the aircraft. The passengers reported they were approaching the airport with visible lightning around the aerodrome. The approach was turbulent. I believe this is the first approach they're talking about. After breaking through the clouds, the city lights became visible when the crew initiated the first go-around. The second approach was turbulent. The approach was continued, and the aircraft's nose began to rise. When the aircraft heavily contacted the runway with a loud bang, the crew initiated another go-around. Now, this is what I call a smash and go, or this is a tricky maneuver, and we do practice this in the sim, a go-around after the aircraft has touched down. Remember, you can... I applaud the captain for doing these go-arounds. Every landing is a go-around with an option to land. And you can go around after a hard landing as well, as long as you have not gotten into reverse thrust. Even though you touch down and the weight on wheels sensors senses that the aircraft is on the ground and the ground spoilers may begin to deploy, when you begin to go around after you touch down, when you add that go around power, the spoilers, the ground spoilers, will automatically retract. Again, as long as you are not into reverse thrust, you can always go around. The crew provided instructions for an emergency landing, including the brace position. On the third approach, as soon as the aircraft broke through the clouds, the flight attendants began shouting to assume the brace position. Touchdown was smooth, more on that in a second, but the aircraft overran the end of the runway. After coming to a stop, the aircraft was evacuated via slides. On a real wet runway, this is really hard as pilots for us to do this because we want every landing to be a smooth landing. And we know on a wet runway, we can usually achieve an even smoother landing because the water helps cushion the blow. But in this sort of a situation, especially with standing water on the runway and marginal stopping conditions, you do want to achieve a hard, firm touchdown in the landing zone. You want to break through that layer of water and get those wheels firmly on the ground, as opposed to a nice smooth landing. If you do a nice smooth landing, it'll take a few extra precious seconds for that weight on wheels switch to activate and to automatically deploy your ground spoilers and get the rest of the braking system and everything working for you on landing. And if you look at the METAR, it doesn't look that bad. Winds 210 at 5 knots. Light thunderstorms in the area, scattered 1800 cumulonimbus, overcast at 9,000. 22 at 15Z, winds 220 at 9 knots. And at 14Z, variable at only 3 knots. Again, thunderstorms in the area, or overhead. At 14Z, winds variable at 3 knots. But still, thunderstorms overhead the airport. Personally, I like to beat the rush and divert early instead of trying to use my superior flying skills to try to land in these kind of conditions. But based on this METAR, the conditions don't look all that bad until you go down there and actually take a look and see what the conditions actually are like. Here's a picture after the crash, but it's only in this picture, probably immediately after the overrun. I can't quite tell, but that may be the ground spoilers in the up position, but I just can't tell from this angle. Are we looking at ground spoilers or are we looking at the flaps? So now let's go back and look at the ADSB data of the first 2 approaches. Here we are on a right base entry for runway 22. Ground speed around 220 knots at 3,000 feet. He'll slow to 180 knots at the marker glide slope intercept. 2,500 feet, 180 knots. So again, this appears to me to be a perfectly stable approach. On glide path, on speed, fully configured. Now, the vertical speed is fluctuating quite a bit between 300 and 800 feet per minute. They're getting into some turbulence on this approach. Okay, right there, it tagged 1,000 feet per minute. Right there at 825 feet. In general, you do not want to exceed 1,000 feet per minute while on final approach. Wow, it went from 1,000 to 300 feet per minute, so something is up. Okay, right away it looks like they abandoned this approach at about 300 feet or so. It's just simply too unstable. Good job. Now let's take a look at the second approach and go around. Again, they're setting up for a good stabilized approach, slowing to 180 knots, getting the aircraft fully configured, getting on the glide path. Again, I'm assuming they've got the ILS approach working for them. Without that precision approach guidance, that would add a considerably greater level of complexity to this nighttime approach. And what's a relative black hole situation, you're surrounded by very, very dark water around this runway. So there's, on glide path, keeping it just below 1,000 feet per minute. There you go. But again, they're having those fluctuations between 300 and 1,000 feet per minute. Again, this is rough ADSB data. 375, 300 feet. Four, 375. Wow. 1,100 feet per minute at 175 feet altitude. They probably got whacked by one of these sinkers and smacked it onto the runway pretty hard. 75 feet, 1,000 feet per minute, not good. And then they're out of here. So a smash and go, boom. You can rotate at your approach speed. You have a lot of energy when you're landing the aircraft to be able to quickly go around. The aircraft will not roll very far down the runway at all. When you pour the coals to it at your approach speed, bam, especially after, ask me how I know, once you hit the runway, you will climb out quite quickly. You have plenty of energy for the go around. So after the second go around, or smash and go as I say, the crew noted a light regarding the hydraulic system and or the braking system, declared an emergency, entered the holding pattern, went through the checklist, sorted things out. This in turn will hopefully allow whatever cell is over the airport to perhaps move along a little bit. Hopefully conditions improve, but still a lot of standing water potentially on the runway. So investigators are going to be looking at a lot of things in this runway overrun. What sort of problem did the aircraft have? What about the runway itself and the condition of the runway? Remember all the different forms of hydroplaning that this aircraft could have been subjected to. Dynamic or viscous or reverted rubber, more likely reverted rubber hydroplaning, especially if they had some sort of a hydraulic or braking system that removed their anti-skid braking capability. That would have greatly hampered their ability to get this aircraft stopped in the remaining amount of runway as well. A couple of words about the emergency evacuation. The A-330 has a total of 8 doors with slides that you can evacuate the aircraft. 1, 2, 3, and 4. But in this rather precarious position, the crew was forced to only be able to use these 2 doors here. 2 left and 2 right. These 2 doors up here are simply too high off of the ground, and you would injure a lot more folks if you tried to send them down those slides. And I believe the 1 left and right doors up front here were probably unable to be opened due to the damage sustained to that end of the fuselage. So thank goodness there was no post-crash fire as a result of this, and this allowed all the passengers to get off the aircraft safely. So a lot of questions for investigators on this aircraft. They will get this information very quickly. We'll know fairly soon exactly what happened on this particular runway overrun with Korean Air. Thanks so much for your support of this channel, especially you folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.